Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. This week, the center of attention for the global refugee crisis shifted from the beaches of Greece, the refugee camps of Jordan, the shoreline of Libya, the fatal waters of the Mediterranean, and the battlefields of Syria, to the riverside home of the United Nations in New York. The worst human displacement problem the United Nations has ever confronted was the focus of two major events aimed at galvanizing worldwide action. For the first time, the General Assembly had called for a summit at the heads of state and government level on large movements of refugees and migrants. And on the margins of the General Assembly, U.S. President Obama hosted another leaders' summit on refugees to pledge significant new commitments on refugees. So what, if anything, is likely to change as a result of these two major events? Is the crisis over refugees worldwide even possible to solve, given the very poor track record that this conundrum has generated over not just years, but decades of strife? With me to look at the global implications of these two meetings in New York, I'm happy to be joined here by Wang Yiwei, Director of the Institute of International Affairs at Renmin University, and Rick Dunham, former White House correspondent for Business Week. But before we start off, let's take a look at this background report.
The global refugee crisis took the spotlight during the ongoing UN General Assembly. Action was called for and an unprecedented declaration was issued.
The New York Declaration marks a political commitment of unprecedented force and resonance. It fills what has been a perennial gap in the international protection system, that of truly sharing responsibility for refugees in the spirit of the United Nations Charter.
And President Barack Obama displayed huge interest in alleviating the problem, underscored by his decision to call for a leaders' summit on refugees at the UN.
We are facing a crisis of epic proportions. More than 65 million people have been driven from their homes, which is more than any time since the Second World War. Among them are more than 21 million refugees who have fled their countries. Everything and everyone they've ever known, fleeing with a suitcase or the clothes on their back.
Obama singled out the situation in Syria, which has displaced 4.8 million people so far, as particularly harmful.
We all know that what is happening in Syria, for example, is unacceptable. And we are not as unified as we should be in pushing to make it stop.
The refugee crisis that's garnered global attention in the past 2 years is worse than any since World War II. It has been seared into public consciousness by images like that drowned Syrian boy and the flood of migrants into Europe. Pledges and commitments have been made before, with little delivered. Hopefully, this conference can really make a difference.
Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. Apparently, two summit meetings are being held in New York in parallel to address almost the same issue, refugee crisis. What do you think of the timing and backdrop against which these two major events take place at the same time?
Well, just after the G20 summit, it also addressed these important issues. It's not only the challenges for European Union, but also in the Middle East, in the world. It's a global issue, global challenges. This is not about the refugees per se. It's also about the global economy growth. It's also about the regional and international stability and peace. So, United Nations should address this important issue definitely as a summit every September.
Can we get a little bit personal with President Obama, who really wants to build his own legacy, and refugee issue for the slim duck might be easier to solve at this moment?
Well, I'm not sure if he can solve the problem, but he can say that he tried to do something. I think you're seeing President Obama try to do things on issues where he can talk, like global warming, like refugees. I think this is a parallel meeting. I don't think it's meant to overshadow the United Nations meeting. And what he's trying to do is not just talk, but try to get some sort of concrete commitments from countries that are allied with the United States. Whether the countries follow through, the track record's not very good. But I think that President Obama both for his legacy and in reality, is trying to get allies of the United States to do a little bit more than they've been willing to do.
Is it a big surprise, if any, that President Obama really wants to honor the glow of the laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize? Because before he became president of the United States, he was given this honor, the laureate. Now, by the end of his 8-year term, he wanted really to make the ends meet.
Maybe.
I think he was a little bit embarrassed to get the Nobel Peace Prize before he actually did anything. I think it was almost given to him for expectations. He's found being president of the United States, being a leader of the world at this time, is very difficult. He hasn't completely extricated the United States from Afghanistan and Iraq. You still have the Guantanamo Bay prison open, so he's had a tougher time than he might have expected at the beginning. But I think he wants to at least show the world he's still trying.
But go beyond the Obama case. I think I remember this African NGO leader who fight against for the poverty and sustainable development in Africa, also win Nobel Peace Prize. So today, peace also not just mean against war, without war. It's also about sustainable development of the human society. So this refugee crisis and also sustainable development, the two major issues of the United Nations Summit, I think remind us that today, that sustainable development is not just for environment, but also for social society per se.
Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, who may have also captured the media attention for the devastating setback in local elections in Germany, on particularly the issue of migrants and refugees. What do you think of her political future?
Angela Merkel's problems, just like what happened in Britain with Brexit, do tell us how deep the suspicion is of refugees, of immigrants. And I would say that Merkel's control of power is at risk at the next election. I mean, these have been not just reverses, but stunning defeats, by large margins for her party. In Berlin, it was expected, but it was far worse than expected. And so I would say that she is in a very defensive position. In the United States, you have a similar situation. Barack Obama is talking in a very open way about refugees, and yet Hillary Clinton, the nominee of his party, is much more cautious, and Donald Trump is blaming refugees. His son put out a tweet about poisoned Skittles candy with 3 poisoned Skittles, meaning refugees who come in who are actually terrorists. And so it's in the United States, it is a volatile political issue too. I think that that's half the problem. One half of the problem is the country is actually not doing enough to help with refugees. The other is the political blowback against parties in power over it.
There's apparently a lot of political theater in the presidential campaign well underway now in the United States between between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. With a record 21.3 million refugees globally, the 193-member General Assembly adopted a political declaration on Monday in which they also agreed to spend 2 years negotiating global compact on refugees and safe, orderly and regular migration. So will that be more of the same? We're going to see more of such similar declarations without being able to execute.
Well, this is a very important step that first time the United Nations addressed the issue at the summit, that this challenge is globally. It's very urgent. It's not just for European unions, not for just simple countries. But at the same time, to solve this problem, it's a long way. I think difficult. Even European Union now, many leaders, many countries have so many troubles. So United Nations take a leading role in this regard. It just start. So the next, all other member countries should take more responsibility to address the real reason for the refugees, not just depression of the accepted migrants and refugees.
David Miliband, the former UK Foreign Secretary who is now President of the International Rescue Committee aid organization, has said any refugee reading the conclusion of Monday's summit bound to say what is going to change, and the answer they would have to be given is very little. When even politicians are as upfront as this, there surely can be little hope of anything concrete emerging in the foreseeable future. Is he being a little bit too cynical?
don't think he's being cynical. I think he's accurate. I think that until we see action, we shouldn't expect action. We've had words for a long time. The United States should have 5 years ago put together a declaration, or 10 years ago, and the underlying issues that have caused the refugees, even before the civil wars in the Middle East, have been around for decades. And so I think Ed Miliband is right. Something actually has to happen, and you have to have more than one meeting. You have to have continuous action, and that's hard.
Joint action, not just
Right.
action.
Joint action, exactly.
But how can you guarantee the joint action?
Right. Well, then you get into the United. That's the reason the United Nations hasn't acted before, because you have so many different interests and so many different views and perspectives on the causes of the refugee crisis that it gets tangled up in that.
Now, I wonder if the British government should deserve credit or special attention for their appeal on the issue of uncontrolled migration. In fact, the British Prime Minister Theresa May has called for a global clampdown on uncontrolled migration, saying it is the right and the duty of countries to control their borders. What do you think of the track record of the British government who voted for a departure from the European Union, particularly over the concern of uncontrolled borders and uncontrolled migration?
What's the meaning of the uncontrolled? It's not just the refugees or migrants pulled into society. It basically means the UK economic comparative advantages. They are different with other European continental countries, because the UK, they are more high-level service workers, particularly for the financial. Those refugees, they cannot work in UK. They just want to enjoy the good welfare. So that's because of the Brexit.
Wait a minute, Yi put his finger on the very sensitive issue. That is the distinction between economic refugees and political asylum seekers. Do you think this is a serious and a major concern for politicians in Europe?
I think it's all been conflated right now in fear of terrorism. I mean, I don't think that this is purely anti-immigrant or purely anti-Muslim. A lot of it is fanning the flames of fear about terrorism. The terrorist attacks in Germany, attacks in England, attacks in the United States, attacks in France. Doesn't make it right that there are demagogues who are pushing it, but I think that's what's led to a lot of the issues right now.
But many of those who have been left homeless, particularly in the Middle East, would have to survive the brutal civil strife in countries like Syria. Even if they couldn't be called economic refugees, they have to be given a safe home. Their needs have to be accommodated in a humanitarian way, whilst most of the refugees seem to have been only taken by developing countries. Developed nations may have done little. What do you think of the current dilemma?
Yes, that means the West still have the hegemony of discourse. Only Europeans, Americans concerned, put the news as international, as the urgent challenge. Actually, people forget Palestine, people forget even what happened in Syria, not just Syria, Iraq, or even Afghanistan. So I think those, even Lebanon, they accept more refugees than any European countries, but no one cares about the Netherlands' difficulties. So still,
and Turkey is maybe the second
yes.
country in the Middle East that has accepted so many refugees.
But what we're thinking of here is the refugees from within the Middle East. If you look at the people who are dying in the Mediterranean, many of them come from North Africa, from the area around Libya, also in West Africa, along the West African coast. And these are all economic refugees, and they are pouring into Europe. I was in Italy earlier in the year, and there are a huge number of Senegalese merchants, people who have come across the Mediterranean and who are working, trying to earn livings there. So I think we have one area of the Middle East and civil strife, but you also have a large number of economic migrants from Northern Africa and Western Africa.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Wang Yiwei, Director of the Institute of International Affairs at Renmin University, and Rick Dunham, former White House correspondent for Business Week. We've been discussing issues that are covered by the two major events at the UN General Assembly to discuss refugee and migrant crisis across the world, particularly in the Middle East. We shall be back in a couple of minutes. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Yue, go ahead with your views on the refugee issue.
Well, I think it's very irresponsible, even dangerous, to connect with the so-called terror attack with the refugee or the migrants. The Western society, like the global financial crisis, European debt crisis, meaning they seek the reasons from external, not from internal. Mm-hmm. Actually, the many terror attack is because they think about the policy. Because the Europeans, American policy in the Middle East, that causes them hate them, not because of they are migrants or refugees. So this is very dangerous.
I'm afraid your analysis will be seriously questioned by those who disagree. For example, they would say the radical and extreme religious thoughts may have contributed so much to the spread of terrorism. For example, the spread of Wahhabism may be viewed as the hotbed for the rise of ISIL.
Right. The problem is that those are two issues. There are very, very few cases of terrorists coming through the Mediterranean. I mean, coming across the border of Turkey, coming through Jordan. But there is a lot of extremism that's becoming homegrown as a result of the civil wars and the international interventions from Afghanistan to the Mediterranean. So I think it's the two things, and the situation for the migrants now is made worse because of the extremism that's not connected to them. The only thing that's connected is that many of them are Muslim.
Yue, many would argue that the United Nations has become just a talking shop, like what we saw and experienced during the Cold War between the two major superpowers. So, do we have a tough watchdog to oversee and execute what has been agreed upon at the UN General Assembly, or on the sidelines of which President Obama hosted a similar one to address exactly the same issue of accommodating needs of refugees and migrants?
Well, we cannot too much pessimistic about the future of the refugee crisis. Give example of the climate change. Many years ago, big countries also blame each other. Even small countries even question about the intentions of the different countries want to use this to stone down some countries' economic growth. But now, with the United Nations leadership, of course, most important, China and the United States cooperation and other European countries' cooperations, the Paris, even passed the deal. So refugee crisis now is just several years, so it takes some time, but we should be optimistic about the future.
Obama said world leaders must accept refugees without religious exemptions. His speech comes as Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump renewed his call for a ban on Muslim immigrants after terror attacks in New York, New Jersey, and Minnesota caused mostly minor injuries. But we never hear any calls for Muslim nations such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, or United Arab Emirates to take on Muslim refugees. How come, Rick?
They won't do it. That's a really good question, because you have a proxy civil war going on in Syria, where you have Iranians and Saudis on opposite sides, and the refugees coming out of that, and neither country is taking the refugees. I believe they have a moral and not just an economic obligation to do it. I mean, I believe that countries of Europe have a moral obligation to take take refugees, and the countries that are closest to it should play a role, not just give money to Turkey to help house the refugees temporarily. They need to take a part in solving the problem, and part of that is leadership, part of that is actually taking people. One reason they don't is that diversity is dangerous to them. They are afraid of having people of other ethnicities or other strains of Islam in their country. People they may not trust or fear are terrorists. These are the same issues that Europe is dealing with.
On the issue of execution and implementation of some of the agreements or declarations that may have been agreed upon on the multilateral occasions. Let me first of all look at what has happened between European Union and Turkey following the foiled coup attempt. Now, the Istanbul process may have come to a standstill due to controversies surrounding the coup. Now, having said this, a similar issue might be addressed about what the World Bank could do. For example, recently, this world body of the United Nations has agreed to provide low and middle-income countries with funding to sponsor their resettlement of some of the refugees in crisis. Do you think this is a very powerful approach?
Yes. The Chinese saying that thieves comes from poverty. So many refugees because of the poverty, because of the gap between rich and poor. So I think that fundamentally solve this problem. We should help them to find their work, the hope. That's the reason always Chinese government highlights that every country they should seek their own development model, not enforced from external. And secondly, to accommodate there are so many refugees who enter European Union and other areas. So we need also money to support them, not to let them to feel disappointed, even to be discriminated views from the local society, so cause more troubles.
Now, let me go back to the thorny issues between European Union and Turkey. Germany, on behalf of the rest of the European Union, agreed initially to fund the Turkish government for their humanitarian efforts to resettle up to maybe 2 million refugees. So what's the latest?
The latest right now is that Germany is acting very cautious. I mean, it's political backlash in Germany, and the number of migrants that Germany is willing to take is likely to shrink.
Is that because of domestic politics and uncertainty in Germany itself, because of the devastating?
The answer, it would be number one. Yes, number one, domestic politics, but you have to argue number two, just the difficulties in absorbing that many people, and straining the social service network of Germany. What you need from countries is not only the willingness to accept people, but the ability to absorb them, to try to make them useful citizens, to find them jobs, to help them assimilate into society so that they don't have the problems of poverty, that don't lead to bad social consequences. And I think that Germany may have been too generous at the beginning for its own social safety net, and that they didn't have the ability to help that many refugees that quickly.
We have noticed discrepancies and disputes concerning the European unity. For example, Austria initially took side with Germany in accepting so many refugees. Now it decided to switch to Hungary for rejecting more of refugees, and perhaps for one day the closure of their borders. And that would mean the beginning of a demise for the European Union. How do you look at this kind of a prediction?
Yes, the refugee crisis actually disunited the European Union, even among the different organs of the European Union. Like the president of the European Council, Tusk, who argued, comes from Poland, that they should give the member states more sovereignty to accept migrants, not enforce them to accept. And Junck from Luxembourg, the president of the European Commission, who argued the European Union should have a single, coherent policy. So they understand also differently. They're so-called the new Europe, the economic not as good as the old Europe. They even cannot, the refugees and migrants cannot find jobs. They even labels competition each other. So they are against more of this coherent policy.
Let's take a closer look at one deep concern. In every country polled, the dominant view is that Muslims in these host countries try to distinct themselves from the majority and the mainstream society. And in fact, of all ethnic groups, they have one of the worst track records of integration. So don't they really just have themselves to blame?
Well, certainly. We say, of course, some scholars argue that among the different religions, the Muslim they are maybe difficult to adapt to the local society. The Bible is not changed so much, so it's a different explanation of that. Maybe I'm not.
That would be a very tough issue for leaders in Eastern and Central European countries. But what about the example or any inspirations that we can draw from the United States, which is proud of being called a melting pot?
That's correct. I disagree with the concept that just because someone is a Muslim, they can't become part of a nation. And the same things were said during the Hitler era about Jews. The Jews were different. Wherever they were different. Mm-hmm. And I think it's equally true of Muslims today. Yes, first-generation people do wear headscarves, they do keep customs, but in the United States, New York City had, at the turn of the last century, had newspapers from 30 different languages. You had nearly a majority of people born outside of the United States. You had Little Italy, you had Chinatown, and people have become part of this the United States. It adds to the diversity. Now, the United States has many, many more ethnicities and national origins than other countries, and it's a shock in Europe where the Muslim minority is by far the largest, but I think it can be done, and I think it's unfair to say that Muslims, just because they're Muslim, can't be part of a society.
Media around the world raises the issue as to why industrial and developed nations are increasingly reluctant to open their borders.
Well, capacity and the reality is not the same. Japan, China, far away from the Middle East, difficult for them to move, large distance. Secondly, Japan is a single nation country; it's a nation state. Mm-hmm. Difficult for refugees to enter the society. China is very multilateral, very diverse, but because of the cultural, linguistic gaps, I think it's difficult also for the refugees to come to China to find jobs and then can live in China. And of course, China is not the reason for the refugees. Chinese government used veto several times in the Syria cases. Otherwise, more refugees pour into Europe, actually.
We are urged strongly by the international community to assume more international responsibilities. Rick?
Well, there are two levels.
Is that also your concern?
I do see countries like Japan, like China, that are primarily one nationality. Now, China has different nationality groups, many of them. Japan has largely Japanese, with Okinawan and a few other, but they historically do not have a lot of immigrants from outside. And very similarly, when we're talking about Iran and Saudi Arabia, the difference is that China and Japan are not in the area immediately affected. But I do think that the countries have a responsibility, and the responsibility may be to help solutions to the problem or raising money for it if they're not willing to take people. But someone has to be willing to take people. This is what happened before the Second World War, where you had refugees from Hitler, and no countries wanted them. No countries in America, no other countries in Europe, and China was one of the few countries through Shanghai where people escaped from Germany.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your participation in this very meaningful discussion about refugee issues. In fact, we should have discussed, for example, long-term refugees, such as those who have been left homeless in the 4 Middle East wars, Palestinians. Next time when we come back, we hopefully will address this one of the 4 major obstacles that get in the way of the Middle East peace process that is said to have ground to a halt. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.